Live from Glasgow, COP26. Thanks for joining us here live in this room, and for those of you online. The Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative is delighted to be at the EIB Pavilion today to discuss sustainable finance innovation and challenges to scale. My name is Hedda Paulson-Mahler. I work for an organization called TIME, which is an impact catalyst, helping finance and business transition to a more sustainable and just economic and financial system. And I have the honor of sitting on the board of the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative, and we are hosting today some wonderful speakers and thought leaders in the space of innovation. We don't know you in this room, and we don't know who's online, so we're trying to make this event as eye-opening and accessible as possible in terms of the players, initiatives, some of the challenges, and our hopes and aspirations for the future. Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative is a wonderful organization that's really promoting awareness and collaboration in sustainable finance for Luxembourg and coordinating with all of our colleagues around the world that are hoping to achieve the same thing. And today we have different voices and perspectives from ministerial, the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, the EIB, the Ministry of Finance, to try to help us look at what are the new and exciting things happening in sustainable finance, what are the challenges that we need to overcome to really scale and make sure that sustainable finance plays its part in the transition. So we are competing with a lot of activities here in Glasgow. Next door we have Brazil. I think they're dancing on the table, so we might need to get the panel to do some good stuff later on. But I did get a card when I signed up that says I'm part of the Party Overflow, and I think there's several people here at the Party Overflow, and I also found out that I am an Earthling. So I recommend to everybody here in Glasgow that you can get yourself signed up to become an Earthling, an official one. So today, we're going to start with the Minister of Finance and then our Minister of Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development, who pre-recorded their messages because they were unable to be here today. We also had to pre-record Julie Becker from the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and the Green Stock Exchange because she's being pulled in many different directions, and we did some pre-thinking by pre-recording them. So we're going to start with some videos before we get to our panel, and then we'll have some live discussion and some Q&A. And delighted to have you in the room and those online. We have a Q&A platform. My colleagues in Luxembourg are going to be maintaining and monitoring that. So if you have any questions, not for you guys, you're going to have to ask me. But if you're online, you can definitely go onto the Q&A section there. I think I'm just going to, without further ado, step down from the stage, introduce you to our ministers and thought leaders on sustainable finance innovation from Luxembourg, and then we'll reconvene here and have some engaging panel discussions and chat with you all. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would have loved to be with you in presence, but I am here in Glasgow in a parallel session organized for finance ministers. Let me tell you how important this session is that you are participating in, which is dedicated to scaling up sustainable finance. Luxembourg has been a pioneer in this area, and I'm going to tell you why. But first of all, we need to set the problem right. We are faced with three challenges, something I called the tricky triangle. We must avoid greenwashing, we must avoid stranded assets that would derive from financial instability, and we must avoid social stranding, which would be the result of shifts in labor force. And obviously to tackle all of that is not easy, and we need obviously the support of the private industry and the private capital, because the billions of the public sector will not do it alone. We need to go from the billions to the trillions. Now, in Luxembourg, we have pioneered this with two projects. One is a climate finance platform that we have set up with the European Investment Bank. The idea here is for the government, for the country, for the public finances to take the first loss And by doing so, the project that otherwise would not have been bankable becomes bankable. It's a method to do de-risking. The other one is the Forestry Climate Change Fund, where we have a similar approach, but on top of this, we focus a lot on reforestation. All this helps also do more in adaptation than mitigation. Now, let's face it, avoid greenwashing is not easy because there's different methodologies. The European Union has been a pioneer in this with the taxonomy. Others are working bottom-up, and the private sector also likes the bottom-up approach. So we need to really have a common framework and a common way to compare what is green and what is not green. I attended the ministerial meeting of the OECD recently as a vice chair. I could see how difficult this is to compare this. There's a figure out there that 40 trillion assets are ESG compliant, but nobody understands or knows how this was measured. So we have also a challenge that we need to face on top of the tricky triangle, and which is to make sure that what we are doing really contributes to reducing the climate change. And in fact, let's not talk about climate change anymore. Let's talk about climate crisis, because we are right in the middle of it. I wish you a good discussion, a good roundtable.
Dear colleagues and friends, dear colleague Pierre Gramegna, ladies and gentlemen, today is Finance Day, and it's quite amazing how fast the concepts of sustainability and finance have become intertwined in the past few years. And it's not without sound reason. Indeed, every fraction of warming, the world will see more intense heat waves, droughts, as well as deadly floods and wildfires. That's scientific evidence. We have to act now and reinforce our global mitigation ambition in the very near term, and this well ahead of 2030, to keep the planet below 1.5 degree warming. And that's why this COP is so crucial. We as leaders must commit to bold steps now and take appropriate action, and we obviously need the financial means to reach our goals. In deciding to change industry and economic sectors, ways of living and mindsets, we must ensure to set the right framework and standards for sustainable and climate-friendly practices to actually emerge. We have to move away from empty promises and shiny marketing messages towards products that are really inducing change. The field of a true and inclusive finance is going to change a lot in the future as we solidify transparency requirements and clarify what the term sustainable economic activities actually means. We urgently need to shift funds towards climate and environmental protection and accelerate the transition to sustainable consumption and production models. But we also need to redefine business as usual. For the financial sector to take on this role, all financial actors need to be actively involved in innovation instruments like green or sustainable bonds, and they need to become the norm. A wise combination of public and private money can of course scale up private investments. As an example, our international climate finance activities really scale what we can contribute as public funding, which in turn increases the impact that we can have as a government. At the same time, we need clear and credible policies and guidelines in line with the Paris Agreement to ensure a real transition and to give the right signal to the private sector. The local and global investments we can make in climate and nature-based solutions via sustainable finance approaches allow us to reduce tremendous amounts of greenhouse gas emissions and to protect livelihoods and ecosystems. The symbiotic relationship between finance and our climate and sustainability commitments thus remains undeniable, and I hope you will find today's discussion on innovation and challenges to scale up sustainable finance engaging. Thank you for your attention.
Here we are at the eve of COP26, and just like the ministers who presented before, they'll be pulled around in many directions, so we took the opportunity to pre-record this interview as well. There's a lot of mixed emotions as we enter COP26, and perhaps reflecting on the minister's words regarding climate crisis. We need to focus now on some of the innovations and the hope and the inspiration we have to use finance to play a role in transitioning to a sustainable and just future. I'm delighted to invite today to this interview Julie Becker from the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. She's a very important player, and her perspective will be important for us to look at where we have opportunities to scale the innovations that we've seen in Luxembourg and beyond. And I'm going to begin with asking Ms. Becker, who perhaps not everybody knows on this, who's joined us today. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, first and foremost, and your inspiration for starting the Green Stock Exchange.
Well, thank you very much, Edda. Good afternoon, all. Well, I've been working for the Financial Center for more than 20 years now, and joined the Luxembourg Stock Exchange in July 2013. A stock exchange is a service provider to capital markets. Our core business is about listing and trading securities, and we have been quite successful for more than 90 years. But a few years after I joined, we came to a point where we asked ourselves, how do we make it last, and how can we contribute also ourselves to the global goals? Because an exchange is about directing capital flows from investors to issuers. And we decided at that time that we had a role to play in unlocking sustainable capital and being able to redirect capital flows towards sustainable developments across the world. And that's how we decided to create the Green Exchange back in September 2016. So it has been 5 years now, and we celebrated this anniversary last September. As a mother as well, and the mother of 2 teenagers, I'm also very concerned about the future of our planet and how we can contribute to make it sustainable and more inclusive in the future. And that's why, as well, I'm completely aware of the massive amounts of money we need and the role that finance should play. Because finance can clearly be a force for good as long as finance is sustainable by default. And that's where I think, and I'm committed to make my utmost, at least, to make finance part of the solution.
Thank you for sharing some personal reflections. I think that is a strong basis for what it is that you've created here in Luxembourg. And I like this concept of by default, because right now I think we're in a phase of designing sustainable finance, and we want to get it to a default setting. Thinking about the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and how we have you in the news quite often. We're very proud of the innovation of what we see. And the world over in capital markets, I think, are quite familiar with you and what the institution is creating. Tell us a little bit about the innovations that you see within your sphere, some of the things that might inspire us to envision new financial markets.
Well, you know, Eda, what we did in September 2016, I remember it was just 9 months after the Paris Climate Agreement. And we were really asking ourselves, what can we bring to the market? Because as an exchange, our mission is also to protect investors. And investors need maximum of information and transparency to make informed investment decisions. But here now, we were talking about green bonds. And investors were really asking themselves, what is green? How is it green? Is it green enough? They needed clarity. So what we decided was to set up this platform, which was the world's first and still leading platform, entirely and only dedicated to sustainable finance securities, where investors can find green bonds, not in particular. So green bonds, just to make sure that this is clear for everybody, are like conventional bonds, but they help finance a project which is considered as green, so linked to the environment, of course. Likewise, a social bond is a bond which finances a social project, and social project being healthcare, education, gender equality, while environmental projects could be a solar power plant, a wind farm, clean transportation, or the financing of electrical vehicles. So all those bonds which finance those specific projects can be displayed on our platform in a centralized way, which helps investors to get all the information they need, and not only financial information, but also non-financial information about how the issuer has allocated the funds it raised through the bonds. And what we ask the issuer is to comply on a mandatory basis with the best market practices, so that investors are in a position that they can compare one instrument to another, because the eligibility criteria are the same for all. So that's what we bring through this platform. And we also ask issuers to provide us with a post-issuance report, which means 1 year after the bond was launched, they have to provide us and investors with information about their commitment. Did they deliver on their commitment? Did they allocate the funds they raised through the bond in the specific project they expose or they disclose initially? That's what is LGX about.
I appreciate that you're taking the time to explain some of the basic components, because I know a lot of your conversations are at ministerial level and with finance experts, and that doesn't make it accessible for everybody. So I appreciate you breaking it down. And I think if I reiterate some of the key points, LGX in itself as a platform is an innovation. And the conversations that you're driving with the organizations that are listing with you is pushing transparency. It's pushing the development of the sector of green and social bonds, which are innovations in themselves. And I know that in the panel, we'll pick up a bit more with both the EIB and with the Ministry of Finance to discuss the sustainability bonds. So we're going to continue on that vein. I'm going to turn the conversation to, beyond our hope and our inspiration, our aspirations for the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and the Green Stock Exchange, Social Stock Exchange. I'd like to talk about the challenges we're facing, because that's quite honest and a reality. Can you tell us a bit about the barriers and the challenges to scale all the wonderful innovations that you started with?
Fair question, Edda, but if I may, just to go on with innovation, because investors today not only want to know where their money is going and what impact their investment will trigger, but they also think now that green side projects, as I was just mentioning, which are financed through green, social, or sustainability bonds that we call label bonds, they want to know more about the issues. They want to understand its sustainability strategy, and that's why through this trend we are seeing new financial products emerging, like sustainability-linked bonds or bonds issued by climate-aligned issuers that we also display on this platform. About challenges, I like to refer to the famous 3Ds: data, definition, and disclosure. Let's start with definition and this knowledge gap we're facing in sustainable finance education and understanding, and the alphabet soup of abbreviations. ESG, SDG, SRI, SLBs, SPTs, and more. And we should really pay attention that we need to keep it simple and make sure that people understand what we are saying and where we're going. So making sustainable finance accessible to all, and making sure that people who want to onboard have enough information and education to understand and to be able to be part of the transition. Second, with data. At the end, we are swimming in ESG data. There are huge volumes of data that are available, and the problem is not the availability of the data, but it's really the usability of those data. Those data so far are not usable by the market, they are not formatted, they are unstructured, while to be able to measure an impact, you need data. To be able to decide a metric on how to measure social bonds or social impact, you need also data. And this is linked also to another element, which is linked to the fact that I'm convinced that in the current society, we really need, especially if we want sustainable finance to go mainstream, to put together different skills, not only economic and finance together, but also science. And this is really a key development, which is also quite a challenge so far. But to come back to the 3Ds, I'd like also to add another element that we face as a challenge is the famous performance myth, where lots of people think that when they invest in a sustainable finance product, they have to, they won't benefit from a financial yield, which is completely wrong. And even the opposite, there's no opposition between the two. There's no need to choose either an ESG investment to get or to create a social or environmental impact, or conventional financial products to get only a financial performance. You can really get the two of them. And I think that this has been proven through the pandemic and the crisis we just crossed, with the high volatility of the market, where it was clearly demonstrated through different surveys that ESG products are much more stable because they are long-term, and this shows clearly that climate risk is investment risk, and investors should be really well aware of this. Last challenge I'd like to mention, which is really, I think, obvious for everybody, greenwashing, as the minister so mentioned. We need to maintain the integrity of the market, and this goes with transparency. This is clearly also the role of exchanges, to make sure that maximum of information, maximum of transparency is given to investors for them to make informed investment decisions.
Thank you. So we have the 3Ds, we have the triple triangle, we are learning a lot about the space and alphabet soup. I wrote an article about that same topic and trying to get those acronyms simplified because it just becomes daunting. But I think you're giving us the opportunity to make what you're doing and the challenges we're facing more accessible. Let's talk about the who, and maybe if we kind of focus in on the solutions. Now, you've given us an understanding of the innovations, the major challenges that you're facing. In terms of the solutions and the organizations that are involved in what we're addressing here, do we have the collaboration and the coordination required to get this to scale? Do we have the right players at the table, the right commitment? Where are we going to see the push to really get this to a systems change?
That's a very interesting question. And because I mentioned 3Ds to express or illustrate the challenges, we could refer now to 3Cs, which are coherence, convergence, and cooperation. What we clearly need is to make sure that we all understand each other. We should really make sure that languages converge, that we adopt the same definition. I think that in that sense, there's a very positive development that has been taken or led by the EU through the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, where they work in a working group together with China on a common ground taxonomy that should be released very soon. It's a pre-recorded message, so we don't know yet. Maybe at the occasion of the COP26, I have hopes that it will be released. And this is very important because it establishes a common basis for all the taxonomy, all the existing taxonomies, so that we can be sure of what is considered as green everywhere worldwide. In terms of C, I mentioned also the C of convergence, so through this common definition, but also harmonized framework of reporting, we really need to make sure that we adopt universal standard and universal reporting like it exists so far in the financial world. This should be also the case for the non-financial information, if we want to make sure that everybody understands, and also investors are able to use the information and the data they need to make informed investment decisions, but also to report on their investment. As we know that in Europe now, investors have to report, but for that they need data, and they need understandable data that are at the end reported in a common, harmonized way. Cooperation, you mentioned cross-border cooperation, is absolutely key, in my opinion, to face those global challenges. And the question is here, by the way, that we should ensure a transition which is inclusive. So now everybody knows that we all have something to do. The questions are really what we should do and who should do more. And I think here that emerging countries are the ones that have done the least to create climate change and will likely be the one who will suffer the most. So it's clearly some questions that we should be able now to put on the table and answer.
I hear you, and I think there's a lot of puzzle pieces that need to come together for us to be able to overcome these challenges. And it sounds like we're on track on the collaboration, and the key players know what needs to be done. But there's still quite a push, and I hope we see that here at COP26. Exactly that type of cooperation that will bring us to the next level. As a final question, maybe putting it down, you talked about everyone's role, and maybe when we talk about everyone, we should look at ourselves and civil society. Do you have LGX can become a very esoteric concept if you are going to your bank and you want to participate in this shift in sustainable finance. Do you have any messages for us?
Well, so I lead the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and the Luxembourg Green Exchange. I'm also a citizen and an individual, and I know that we all have a role to play, and I'm convinced that every step matters. So we really need to move also from transition seeking into transition action. So if you don't know what to do, you could also ask yourself what is important to you and what kind of change you would like in the society. And one way to start would be, of course, to change your own behavior or to think about what you could do better, but also to invest in companies and in projects that are focusing on what is important to you and what would make the economy more inclusive and the society more prosperous at the end. So I think we all have a responsibility in this change, but we all have a duty to be part of the solution.
I think those are strong and important words to end with, and I want to thank you so much for sharing not just your professional view on the sustainable finance innovations and challenges, but also being so personal, which makes it accessible and perhaps inspirational for all of us to think about how we can empower ourselves to be part of the transition and the changes that need to happen, because it becomes, again, very high level when we look at financial institutions and the large landscape of finance and economy, but we're all part of it and we have a role to play. So thank you again, Julie, for your time. Best wishes running around at COP26. I'm sure you're going to be pulled in many directions, and we appreciate the time you gave us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Speaking of the tricky triangle, seeing myself here and being there and seeing Julie outside rushing past this pavilion, we're really doing this hybrid event where we've got some pre-recordings, you're live, they're live, and to help me compete in what are we called, the party overflow room? Yeah. The party to help me compete with the Brazil pavilion next door, which I hear, but I don't think the people online hear and you guys are listening to. I have two fantastic panelists who are joining me. I have Lennart Duschinger from the Minister of Finance, advisor on sustainable finance, and also aboard, well, helping also the LSFI, so you wear a couple of different hats. Thanks for coming, Lennart.
Thank you.
And Peter Monroe from the EIB, the Climate Bank. Peter, thanks for joining us today.
Welcome.
As well. Let me see here. I guess first, perhaps for those of you in the room, you are here, you're living the ambiance of COP26 and you have your own reactions and thoughts. But for those that aren't here, I wanted to open up with the question of how you feel in this place. How are you experiencing this event, what you're doing and hearing and learning? Do you have any insights to share for the audience? Lennart, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think it's my fourth COP. What I always tell my friends is that, so really the ministries that are running the show are the ministries of the environment. So they're doing all the negotiations, and the negotiations are really hardcore. They sometimes go through the whole night, so you see people sitting on the floor, like eating really quickly. People are having naps because it's exhausting. It's a lot of people, lots of energy, lots of noise, very active. Yeah, but otherwise, I mean, it's a really great opportunity to listen to different people speak from all over the world. There are great personalities that come every year to the COP, so that's always really fun.
Feeling positive and enjoying it. Did you find a place to take a nap? If so, could you please tell
Let everybody else know. I will.
I'm
not going to share my secrets.
Thanks, Lennart. Peter, do you have some observations or learnings to share with us?
Sure. I was just thinking last night about what Mr. Draghi said at the G20, and he said, well, you know, you can't go it alone. And here, it's impossible to go it alone. It's such a hive of activity. There's so many people, so much energy and activity. I think for those who are not here, you have to understand, you know, this is really the nexus of change, and change is on. You know, it's no longer in people's imagination, it's very real. So many thanks to Luxembourg for inviting EIB today to join this conversation. I think it symbolizes the importance of cooperation. Mr. Draghi also mentioned multilateralism. That's very much what it's about. You can't walk 20 yards here without encountering 30 nationalities. I mean, this is what it's about. It's about working together. So I think that's my overall feeling about COP26 so far.
I think that captures well. Audience, you guys feel the same thing? There's an incredible, palpable energy here. It's so international, and it's so exciting to be part of it. Fantastic that we can sit together. It's been a long time, and I think the pandemic certainly has changed the atmosphere. Everybody's wearing masks. We're socially distant, but everybody's hearts and minds are in the right place. So we are here to discuss innovation in sustainable finance. And not everybody in this room or listening may know what Luxembourg is doing. And so we have some wonderful speakers here to share some exciting developments. You saw Julie Becker speaking about the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and the Green Stock Exchange. I wish we could have captured her to come in and answer your questions, but it is just one of those kinds of events where it's not going to happen. But you might catch her running around outside afterwards. Perhaps I will begin, Lennart, with you, thinking about innovation and the role of government. Do you have some thoughts? Is that the government's role to be driving or enabling? And how do you see Luxembourg's role in sustainable finance innovation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think traditionally, it's not the government's role to really be in the driving seat of innovation. I think it's more of a role for the government to be an enabler of innovation, to really create a financial system or an environment that is fruitful ground for the private sector to really innovate. So I think that's the most important. However, we are in a crisis. So I think I wouldn't say that the government's in the driving seat, but I would say we are becoming a more active enabler of innovation and of developing, a financial system that helps more with this whole transition. I think, Luxembourg is a tiny country, 600,000 people. Our budget is tiny compared to other countries' budgets, so we really have to be smart about the way we use our budget. So what we try to do is we use the money really in a smart way to have a big impact with the little that we have. So we try to really mobilize the private sector a lot. Because even if now all the governments would use their budgets that they have available, it wouldn't be enough to really drive the transition that we need. So the private sector, the money is absolutely crucial. So that's what we try to do. We set up, and we're slowly becoming really good at it, setting up public-private partnerships. So together with the private sector, where we set up, for example, what the minister spoke about as well, the Luxembourg EIB Climate Finance Platform, where we set aside an envelope of 70 million euros to be invested into climate impact funds, where we, as the government, take. So when you invest in a fund, you have different share classes. So we invest in the highest risk share class. which we call a junior tranche or first loss piece. So if something goes wrong, first the money that the government invested in that tranche goes out the window, and then the other tranches are more protected, which means that the private sector has less risk when they invest in those funds. So we try to mobilize the private sector to invest in those funds. And so for now, we've invested in 6 funds, and it's going really well. So that's a really great platform. Then we've set up an international climate finance accelerator, which is an accelerator. So a 2-year program where we look for there are different accelerators in the world, but mostly for business startups. So because we have a big fund industry in Luxembourg, we were looking at funds, and they also need help. So we created an accelerator specifically for investment funds, where they get a bit of money and they get help from the private sector to launch the fund quicker. Because it takes 3 to 4 years for funds to be launched. It takes around €500,000, so lots of investment in terms of human resources as well, not only money. So but there we try to support them. We now have, I think, around 20 funds in the program, which has, I mean, an exponential potential of mobilizing money. And then we also have a forestry and climate change fund where we also invested alongside the private sector into this fund, which has a slightly different investment strategy where they also take more risk in order to support more sustainable ways of investing in forestry. And there it was one of the issues also that we see a lot is that investors, they're really scared to invest in these new funds because there is no track record. So they can't say, well, these are the 10 success models that we've already seen, so we trust to invest in this because we see that it works. They don't know that it works. And so we invest alongside them to help them and to take a bit of that risk away. Was that an answer to your question?
No, of course it was. No, these are fantastic examples. And I mean, as a Luxembourg citizen, I must say I'm extremely proud of the ways that the government is engaging on first loss capital and the climate finance accelerator. And if you talk about scaling, this morning they had a really nice presentation. They did a Dragon's Den for these first-time fund managers. Often very experienced fund managers in climate finance, but because it's their first fund that's tackling climate, they don't necessarily get the attention that they need or deserve. So we did a fun Dragon's Den type of session this morning to show that. And what I find interesting is I've spoken to some DFIs that heard this idea of accelerating fund managers in climate and recognizing we can do that with other sustainability goals, that other first-time fund managers need this support structure. So I hope we can get to this idea of scaling ideas. We can pilot it here. We can start these types of collaborative public-private partnerships, but it needs to happen elsewhere and maybe everywhere. Yeah,
I mean, I'm just thinking of that. We have a few funds in the accelerator that are super innovative. It's really exciting for my passion, for me as a geek in sustainable finance. It's super exciting. One of them is investing in China in plant-based food alternatives. So that's like super cool, super innovative. Then we have a fund that invests purely in plastic alternatives. And I mean, there's so many different funds where those models are just not developed yet, really. And so it's cool work.
I hope you have a chance to follow the Climate Finance Accelerator. It's a very interesting one. You didn't mention the sustainability bond, but I'm going to turn to Peter and because I'll get back to that one. From the EIB, the Climate Bank. Could you share a little bit about innovations from your side?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know us, the EIB is the EU bank, and we're also the EU Climate Bank. And what do we have to do? Well, we have to lead by example. So since the 1st of January this year, all our new business had to be Paris aligned. That may sound simple, but it's actually quite a revolution in financial markets. I think if you look around the financial institutions, you'll not find too many who can say that they're already on that track. Also, we're engaging with counterparts to ensure that they develop a net zero strategy. That's also a big shift for many institutions, and we can help them with that. But I'd like to also recall some of the practicalities. I mean, that's the kind of what than the how of scaling up climate finance. I think Minister Gramegna framed it very elegantly when he said, we need to avoid greenwashing. That's the negative part. And the positive solution part is to add a taxonomy or a set of definitions which give us a roadmap. And the second point he highlighted, which I really like, was about de-risking. And that speaks to Lennart's point about these vehicles which take on the riskier slice of an investment and enable the projects to get over the line. Because especially in developing countries, this is an issue, and with new technologies. So that's something we're also very engaged with. Firstly, on taxonomy, we're one of the co-designers of taxonomy. We're also committed to implementing taxonomy, the EU taxonomy. And secondly, a lot of what we do is about providing additional solutions to financial markets where the market alone cannot fix it. That often means either taking on longer term or riskier projects that the private sector alone will perhaps not do. And I think we can talk later about what kind of tools that involves, but I think these are two themes that you will see coming again and again through COP26. We need a roadmap, and then we need capital that's committed to bridging some of the gaps.
Thank you, Peter. I think if we interviewed people around the biggest challenges to sustainable finance and what's kind of been inhibiting the space, it's certainly been taxonomy top on the list and the standardization. So I think bringing that up is an important one. And EIB has been a very active player in a lot of the projects in Luxembourg and beyond in trying to innovate approaches in the financial systems. But maybe I'll go back to the sustainability bond, which is an exciting one, and you didn't mention it. So maybe you want to share a little bit to this fascinated audience and everybody online. Could you share?
Yep, sure. The sustainability bond. So where should I start? As we all know, a country finances itself by taxes, but countries can also take on debt. And so they issue sovereign bonds. There is now this movement of issuing sustainable sovereign bonds. Lots of countries have done that already. Most of the countries are doing green bonds. And so there are mostly green bonds, there are social bonds or sustainability bonds. Sustainability being half green, half social. So we decided to do that because that is mostly in line with our national sustainability strategies, the green and the social part together. So last year we issued our first sustainable bond, a sustainability bond for 1.5 billion euros. We were a little scared because, which brings me back to the innovation side. So why is it innovative? It's innovative because we are the first AAA rated country to issue a sustainability bond. We are also the first European country to issue a sustainability bond. And so we were scared to go to the market because we didn't know how the market was going to react to it. And we need the debt. And so there's always a risk that you don't actually get enough money by emitting, or enough investments by emitting the bond, but it went really well. So that's good. It also shows how the market is developing. And maybe another point on the innovation. So we tried to really go a lot further than what other countries did. So we aligned with the ICMA standards, which is the International Capital Markets Association in Switzerland. They're really great, a really great website as well. Lots of guidelines on how to do bonds, how to structure bonds, and they're like the global reference. So we aligned with those standards, like nearly all issuers of bonds. But then we went further. So we structured the bond last year where the taxonomy wasn't fully out yet. So we took everything that we had at that moment about the taxonomy. We took everything that we had at that moment about the new EU green bond standard that we are developing in the Commission as well. And we already incorporated those standards into our sustainability bond. And then so that was last year in September, we issued our first bond report 2 months ago. And so for the bond reporting, we also went a lot further than we actually, than the market practice. So we added, and it makes me laugh because Julie just said, about the alphabet soup, so I'm going to throw some stuff at you as well. We used the IMP model, Impact Management Project. and we used Iris Plus, which I also highly recommend. Really great website. So it's Iris, IRIS Plus. Everybody Google it, homework. You can create a profile online, it's super easy, and then it really helps you in identifying like sustainable or a way of reporting on sustainability of assets. And so you can start with the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals. So you could, for example, pick the SDG 13, which is climate action, and then click on it, and then it gives you different sectors that fall within climate action. And then when you click on that, it gives you like impact indicators that you can measure on once you've done the investment in that. So it's a really great tool. I highly recommend. So we used it for the first time as well, which was super complicated because we had to make it all up as the first government to ever do that. So read the bond report if anyone's interested. If you have questions, let me know and we can answer them. We had to set up a sustainability bond framework where we define all the definitions that we use before we issue a bond. It was just translated into Chinese because the Chinese are really interested into it, so it's a great win. The European Commission used our framework to inspire themselves for the EU Green Bond Standard. And we've had one-on-one calls with different countries in the EU as well, because they might also now do a sustainability bond. Yeah.
So you guys get homework assignments on the alphabet soup. We had the 3 C's and the 3 D's and IMP and Iris Plus. I mean, honestly, these are fantastic tools, but we do have to simplify things.
Yeah.
What comes to mind, listening to you and thinking about the sustainability bond and being the first European country that's issuing one, I'm happy to hear that people are inspired and watching your tools and you're getting phone calls from China saying, how did you do that? That's perfect. But I'm wondering why are these not scaling? Why aren't there more sustainability bonds? I mean, the green bonds is something that people feel a bit more familiar with, but I'm going to begin with you, Lennart, and then I'm going to move over because I want to get some EIB perspective as well. But why are these innovations not scaling faster?
Yeah, so I think, or maybe I'll start with a point that my minister, the Minister of Finance, he also mentioned. There are currently, I think, $40 trillion of assets that are using an ESG investment approach, so an environmental, social, and governance approach to investing. That sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But then when you really go into detail and you ask, well, what are they actually doing? Most of them are doing the absolute bare minimum, which is they're using an exclusion list. And so they say, they take 1,000 companies that they want to invest in, and then they do an exclusion of fossil fuel companies. That's for someone who, and before I joined the ministry, I worked in real impact finance. For me, that's borderline insulting. To use an exclusion list is really the bare minimum. So a lot of those 40 trillion assets, that's what they do, and then they say it's ESG. Which it really isn't. So that brings me back to the point that Peter also mentioned before, which is the taxonomy. We need rules and definitions of things. If it follows these criteria, then it's sustainable. If it doesn't, then it's just not. So that's really important. And now I forgot why I was saying this.
I'll come back to you. And I was just asking about challenges to scale and why we do not have more sustainability bonds. But I think, somebody has to start and somebody has to make those, because there's a lot of effort to get things started, right? You make a lot of mistakes, you have a lot of challenges, digging through Iris Plus, et cetera. And hopefully with this concept of sharing learnings in sustainable finance, if Luxembourg says, give me a call, this is what we've done, this is how we did it, do it yourselves, do it better if you want to. That's I think a very positive message. I'm going to pivot and swivel towards you. Would you like to share a little bit more about challenges, opportunities for scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to, if I may, Hedda, make 2 points. The first one is to pick up on Julie Becker's point earlier from the stock exchange. I think the 3 Ds are crucial: definitions, data, and disclosure. We can't emphasize that enough. And the second point is, you've rightly raised the question about which products can mobilize, and absolutely the different forms of sustainable bonds are all good, actually, on the whole. And what's interesting is that the Principles for Responsible Investment ran a study of green bonds alignment with the EU taxonomy, which is the sort of gold standard, if you like. And they found that the majority of them were aligned. So in other words, the voluntary efforts of the market and the voluntary market standards from ICMA, which Leonard mentioned, have proved highly effective. And let's get some perspective on this. This is now a significant market. This year to date, we are at almost 1 trillion of sustainable debt issuance. And the forecasts, for example, from SEB predict 1.5 trillion by the end of the year. That would be double last year's number. Anyone in finance would, finds those kind of growth rates absolutely mouth-watering, and the scale is now sufficiently industrial to really get us all energized. So I don't really share this concern about whether or not one particular format of bond is going to take off or not. I think collectively it's going in the right direction. And coming back to the point about data, as Julie mentioned, this is absolutely critical. I think it's good that Luxembourg and the Luxembourg Exchange are leading by example. So they took the initiative not just to gather data on the bonds they list, but on all the bonds in the market. So as an investor, you can come in there and see the total universe. That's a great idea. And I really give them credit for that. And we also know that as the regulators step in, we're going to get a vast improvement in the data quality and comparability. Julie mentioned there's a lot of data out there already, but the quality is a bit of an issue. This is going to improve, for example, in the EU with the forthcoming and already some in motion disclosure standards. So I think the pressure from the investors is going to add to that. So with these forces coming together, we're going to see that we have the products, we start to have the toolkit in terms of the data and the disclosure. So I think we're moving in the right direction.
Excellent. That's very positive. And I'm going to go back. Did you want to finish your last thought from earlier, or are you?
I have no more thoughts.
No. Len is spent. No, he's not. He has lots more to say. And I want to maybe talk a bit more about solutions and acceleration. So, Peter, you say we're on track. We have taxonomy, we have new standards, we have regulatory push. We've got a willingness of the players, from sovereign players to private markets and institutional markets. So yet I still believe and see silos created, and I still see that there's pockets of innovations happening in these different domains. And I'm wondering how we get the collaboration to the next level, because we are in what Minister Caramagna said, a climate crisis. This is not a climate change conference, this is a climate crisis conference. How do we expedite and accelerate those shifts? As you're spent, no, you said you're spent. So I'm going, Peter, you want to start?
Yeah. Well, I'll make 2 points. The first one is commitments to 2050 targets are not the same as commitments to 2030 targets. So I think the critical thing is that the major actors think about their near-term targets as a complement to their long-term targets. If we're not credible for 2030, we're definitely not credible for 2050. And in our case, in our institution, we also have 2025 targets. So we're being extremely aggressive about this in terms of setting ourselves near-term objectives that are tangible. And the second point is, and I think we'll maybe discuss this further in a moment, is what can citizens do? And there's a great new book out by Sir Dieter Helm, a professor from New College, Oxford, entitled Net Zero, How We Stop Causing Climate Change. And now this kind of brings it down to ground level, because he emphasizes that to achieve net zero in 2050, we need to address both the production side and also the consumption side. And that means consumers need to be alert to their role in this. And I think maybe we can discuss a little bit, what they could do.
That's a great point. You preempt a question that I always like to end. You saw I did with Julie as well about, a call to action for us as individuals. If you're not sitting in a ministry or at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange or at the EIB, but maybe I'll couple both of those questions and go back to you, Len, if you've now recharged your thoughts.
Yes.
On, again, challenges to scale, but more on the solution side, and also if you have a message for us as individuals, as consumers, as investors.
Yeah. So as you said, I think the silos is a huge problem. I mean, we see it now with the sustainability bond. It's changing, like we're working together a lot more. So we had a call with Ireland and with our Dutch colleagues because I asked them, what do I do? Because they've already issued green bonds and nobody in the ministry had ever done it. So they helped us a lot and I learned a lot from them, and now we are also teaching other countries. And so I think it's really nice also to have that relationship with other countries. What we have now, which is also quite new, for the last 2 years, we now have the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. And so there, for the first time, ministries of finance have a place where we all meet. So now we have 65 ministries of finance from all over the world that come together regularly to discuss all these different policies that we are developing. So for the first time, we are comparing, carbon pricing or sustainable bonds, and so it's really great to have that. And so these silos are slowly breaking down, and we're working together more. And then maybe I'll move to the other question about...
a message for individuals, people, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So when I talk, two things. So I teach a class on sustainable finance at university as well, and what I always tell the students is, you are important. You are important because people underestimate their own power. And so what you do, even what you think is important, but that's a whole spiritual different question, but what you say and what you do is important, and how you spend your money is a message that you send every single day. And what people often don't understand is that every single investment you do is an impact investment. All of the investments are impact investments. People just don't know. They think an investment is, you look at risk and reward, and then so you look at how much risk are you willing to take to earn X amount of money. But there is a huge impact behind every investment. So it's important every investment is an impact investment, because every euro you spend has an impact on the world. And so everything that the students, I always tell them, everything you do is important. You are important, which is always a good message, I think, to give them as well. And the other thing is, so my sister's a psychologist and my brother is a police officer. So they're normal people living in a normal world, not knowing anything about finance. And so I was talking to my sister and she said, well, thank God I don't invest money, so I don't really have to think about all of this. And so I said, well, actually, you have a current account, you have a savings account, you have a car insurance, you have an insurance for your house. And she's paying into 2 pension funds, the public pension fund and a private pension fund. So those are already 7 accounts where she doesn't take active investment decisions, but all of that money is invested. And so it goes somewhere and it has an impact. She's just not aware of it. And when I explained this to her, she was really shocked, because I said, statistically, your money is invested into weapon production, just so you know. And she was shocked by it. And so I say, it's another important message that I always tell my students as well. Reach out to your bank, just send an email regularly, do it every 3 or 6 months, send an email and say, well, how do you invest the money that's on my current and my savings account? And send an email to your insurance company and ask, where are you actually investing the money that I pay you every month or once a year? And same for the pension fund. I mean, pension funds, it's even worse because they're preparing to pay our pension in 40 years. But in 40 years, climate has changed already so much. So why, now doing investments that are actually negative for in 40 years when you're paying me out the pension makes no sense. So reach out to those companies regularly, because it's, the bottom up is super important. So it's just sending an email. Yeah.
We have peers in the insurance and pension and banking world who are like, no,
stop. It's a secret. Annoy them.
It's really important. And I'm going to echo, because you shared a lot of important points, but I want to echo this idea. Impact can be both positive and negative. And trying to get that ratio right and at least be aware of that. I mean, you can talk about complex financial products like bonds, but it really comes down to our consumption money. It comes down to our investment capital, and to try to identify it, be aware of it, and shift that ratio. We call it the impact imperative at time. And then you talked about this, the sharing is caring within the finance ministers. Mm-hmm. And I think this is this spirit of sustainable finance, which used to, traditional finance tends to be keeping your cards close to your chest. But in sustainable finance and these innovations, I'm still hoping that there's a new culture of, again, opening your books and saying, this is our sustainable finance bond, this is our partnership, this is our taxonomy, use this, and let's accelerate the shift that needs to be happening. Yeah. And that's really the spirit of COP26 too. This is, everybody's here to share and to learn, and you are important. I learned from Leonard. So Peter, you are important. Can you share some last thoughts before we open up for questions?
I like this sharing point. I mean, there's an interesting session here next Monday about open source ESG data. A lot of big players there. Watch out for that one. On a more personal level, I'm in the market for a personal decarbonization app, which disciplines me to get decarbonized. So you heard it here. The next big opportunity, whichever teenager comes up with that in his bedroom, is onto a good thing. On a more serious note, for those who are active in financial services, let's not forget there are plenty of solutions out there. I mean, we've talked taxonomy. There are sectoral iterations of that through Science-Based Targets Initiative, things like that. So there are tools out there. So my feeling is that what's important is we get our toolkit, we start to iterate, and we start to put it into practice and put it into action. We shouldn't say, oh, there's no solution. That's not the case. There are solutions out there. They could be improved. They will be improved. We are learning by doing. There's no magic bullet. We just need to keep moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Peter. And I think you just maybe suggested something for the Climate Finance Accelerator, the decarbonization app. For anybody who's applying to ICFA, that's a good one. Thanks for sharing your personal thoughts. We have about 12 minutes, exactly 12 minutes. And what I'd like to do is to open up to questions, either from the audience here, and I am sitting with not one but two gadgets, one my notebook and the other my phone, and I think you also have the Q&A app. No, you don't, so I'm not going to ask you. So I have a Q&A app, speaking of apps, with some audience questions coming in, but we're finally live in a personal space, so I really want to open up to the audience here as well. Unfortunately, we don't have the two ministers who spoke in the beginning or Julie with us, but I have two fabulous panel members, and even the LSFI team who's online and will give me cues. Any questions from you that you would like to log? If not, I will move. Oh, yes, we already have one question in the front. We have two questions in the front. All the people in the front have questions. Let's start with you, please.
Yeah.
Peter,
I'll repeat the question.
Yeah, thank you.
The question is EIB doing de-risking only in emerging markets or also in Europe? And who is taking those sort of high risk tranches, which some consider to be, or maybe equity tranches? We're doing both, is the short answer. And we are participating in some of these high risk tranches, but we generally like to crowd in others. And what one tends to find is that governments such as Luxembourg and development finance institutions, I see acknowledge my colleague from EBRD here, we're often sitting in the same room, opening our checkbooks, writing the check, not indiscriminately. I mean, we are integrating climate risk assessments systematically into our business. We already had for many years a carbon price, which was usually above market. So yeah, the long answer is we are really trying to do more of this, but it depends on risk capacity. And I think what we're seeing now is that if we want to scale up much more, we need to think about if there should be fresh infusions of risk capital into the development institutions or through partnerships with countries such as Luxembourg, which have very generously put their capital at our disposal in some cases. And that, by the way, was the kind of the trick that we used in structures like the Juncker plan in Europe to promote recovery after the financial crisis. And I think the same model of patient private money can be, patient public money matched with private money can be very, very effective.
And the combination of the two together in blended finance.
Right, blended finance, that's the buzzword.
That's the buzzword. But First Loss Capital is a fantastic tool, and thank you for asking about it. Sir. Did you hear the question, Leonard?
Yeah.
Could you repeat it? And then maybe even Peter wants to join in on that one.
In short, how can we help to create more bankable projects? First thing that comes to mind is we also support a lot of technical assistance facilities. So when you have a real impact fund, you have the investment fund, and on the side, in parallel, you have a technical assistance facility. Where, I mean, it depends on the size of the fund and what you want to do, but it's between 2 and 5 million, I would say, in general, in size. And so that's money that's not in the fund. It's being used in parallel to help companies in the country where you want to invest to develop more and to become a bankable asset. So I think the TA, technical assistance, is the main instrument that how we can help, you know, from home in the countries for that. But let me think. Maybe I'll come up with something else as well.
That sounds good.
Yeah, this is an important point. The technical assistance, actually, we're starting to do a lot more technical assistance, especially in developing markets. But not only, yeah, we also work with banks in the European Union, helping them to understand things like taxonomy, which is, you know, quite a new thing. The other thing which is interesting, actually, is helping, for example, financial institutions to understand what's in their balance sheet. The stuff that's been locked away there for years, they're not quite sure if it's green or not. There have been some interesting studies showing that roughly 5% of all assets of systemic banks in emerging markets are green. But the banks were not necessarily aware of it. So what often helps is to bring in an outside set of eyes, a fresh set of eyes, look at those balance sheets with kind of expert assessment. And this is actually producing a major flow of new green assets into the market. They were kind of ready to go, but hidden away.
Hidden away.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how to maybe integrate some of the questions we're getting online with what we're hearing from the audience. And by all means, please indicate if you would like to ask. But I'm thinking perhaps picking up again on Luxembourg's role, the question here about how to get Luxembourg to support the transition towards all sovereign bonds being sustainable. All. That's a big order. And maybe that picks up a little bit more about, what can you do to help expedite this shift? And maybe if I add another question in it too, we talk about the big players collaborating together to bring us where we need to go. But what about the smaller players? Do they have a place at the table? Can you take that double whammy question and synthesize a succinct answer?
I'm mostly confused about what question you're asking now, because there are like 7 questions.
Okay, no, 2 questions. Number 1, how can Luxembourg expedite the transition of all bonds to be sustainability bonds, all? And the second one is there room at the table for smaller players in the collaboration and design of the future of sustainable finance?
I mean, we have our limits of influencing other countries for the issuance of their sovereign bonds. So I think the best we can do is through international organizations. So for example, I sit on the member state expert group on sustainable finance at the European Commission. And so there I'll do a presentation of our experience and what we also the lessons learned and the problems that we had to solve for all of this and also, I mean, just being very practical, there's a huge difference, for example, in how much it costs to do a sustainable sovereign bond. Because when you do a traditional sovereign bond, it takes a month to go to the market, and you're basically selling your country, and that's it. And when you do a sustainable bond, you have to write a framework, and then you have to identify all the sectors and different definitions, and then you have to organize the impact report, and you have to do reports every year, and so we had to hire a consultant to do all of this work with us, and so that was super expensive. And so those are lessons that we like to share also with the other countries, to not to scare them away, but to say that all of this is doable. And that everyone's experience is different, but also very similar. And I think that's how we kind of get the framework translated into Chinese and then work with the Chinese on this. Or in the coalition of finance ministers we have, I had a workshop last year where I participated, where I shared also the whole experience that we had and the lessons learned. And the mistakes that we made, which we are not going to repeat next time, but then other countries shouldn't do the same mistakes that we made. So I think that's mostly it. Maybe another word on all bonds to make them sustainable is a bit much today, because there are lots of assets that are traditionally being financed by a government that are not yet identified as being sustainable, or there are no technical solutions yet to make that sustainable, which we are working on. But so today, not all bonds can be sustainable by definition. But tomorrow you got it covered. Can and they will be. That's where we're going. Yeah.
And if I just think I hear a fantastic answer to the question about smaller players at the table. If Luxembourg can influence China towards sustainability bonds, we have a perfect answer for are the smaller players at the table. But it's not just countries, and Luxembourg is a country with lots of might. We only have a couple minutes left, so I'm just going to ask Peter if you wanted to address anything on this kind of partnerships and collaboration, small players. Please.
Yeah, sure. So SMEs are one of the areas where we are doing work at the EU platform on sustainable finance, and the EU Financial Reporting Advisory Group is looking at financial reporting also for SMEs, but both SMEs and large caps. And the kind of takeaway is Leonard mentioned there is a cost, there's a resource question. This is especially acute for SMEs. It's less of an issue for big companies. But for SMEs, we need to figure out how we can simplify and standardize. And I think this is what we'll be doing over the next couple of years, developing solutions that SMEs can readily absorb. It's a process, but we will get there. And I think in a couple of years' time, I think it's going to be, in fact, mandatory for the Commission to publish some guidelines. So, it's coming. We should not believe that SMEs are out of the picture. They're very much in scope for the future.
Thank you, Peter. I'm very heartened by this conversation. I find sitting next to representatives from, an enormous bank and an enormous country, small country with a big heart. I think we really have the intentionality, the willingness, the drive to put sustainable finance as a piece of the puzzle of where we are trying to go. So I think we're on track. And on behalf of the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative, who is hosting today and put all these fantastic players together, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the online audience and to the LSFI team in the EIB Pavilion. It was delightful to have this time with you.